Good morning, everybody. It's Sharon Avery here, and we're getting ready to go as you enter from the waiting room. Thank you for your patience. We're going to get started at 8 o'clock sharp, which is about a minute from now. So grab your cup of tea, your cup of coffee, your glass of water, set yourself up comfortably for another of the last of our series of Fallout Report webinars for 2020. What a year it has been. The chat is usually pretty active in these webinars. So as you arrive and get comfortable, please say hello, introduce yourself. Let us know you're there. Send a message out to the warm gathering of community neighbors and friends. We have organizational leaders here. We have some of our fund holders and donors and funders. We have folks from government. We have a wide range in the audience every time for these gatherings. And so please do introduce yourself and tell us how you're doing today. As you're settling in, I see the chat is already starting up. I want to remind folks that there's lots of intense conversation that happens in these webinars. And if you have questions, don't wait to ask them, just put them in the chat. The team will be collecting them for the Q&A session at the end of the conversation. Remember, many of you have signed up to stay on for an extra half hour between 9 and 9:30 for a couple of informal conversations. If that's news to you and you're interested, I'll say more about it in the official part of this webinar. But do stay, please feel welcome to stay for some informal conversation between 9 and 9:30 today. We are filling up fast and I'll get started in about 20 seconds. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sharon Avery, and I am so proud to be part of the Toronto Foundation team and really have I get to do this opening for the webinar, but the real work is done behind the scenes by the team, and I'm so grateful to have them in my life. This is the last webinar Toronto Foundation is doing in 2020, and what a year. And aren't we all looking forward to ringing the New Year bell to 2021 and looking ahead, hopefully, to a brighter and less challenging year ahead, although you know, the conversations we're going to have today are going to suggest that we still have a long way to go. Back in March, we started with some COVID webinars, and thanks to our good friends at Van City Investment Community Bank, we have been able to continue bringing you important content around COVID, including our Fallout report that came out just a few weeks ago. Vital Signs report focused on 7 months of data and really a stark picture of the inequalities that exist in Toronto. And thank you to Van City for supporting that work and the work of this webinar, which is the third in our series coming out of the Fallout report. We spent those first 2 webinars talking about the hard truths of COVID and its effect on some Torontonians and not others. We've talked to nonprofit leaders to get their insights on the way forward. Today, we're going to talk about using voices. We're going to talk about advocacy. And this is a particular favorite area for me because it is one of those spaces that sometimes donors hesitate to go in. But if COVID has taught us anything, it is that our voices are as critical as our money. And if I could convince donors to do more for in the advocacy space, it would be just a gift to all of us in terms of the real change that happens. So I'm so glad we're exploring all the different ways in which our local nonprofits need to use their voices to fight for their futures and the rights of the community members they serve. And what better day to do that than on the International Day of Human Rights? That's right, that's what today is. In 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when we talk about an equitable recovery, protecting basic human rights has to be central to our approach and our actions. On that note, I want to acknowledge that we recognize and appreciate that our Indigenous neighbors are not necessarily looking for equity, but they do want their rights respected. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Patti Pettigrew today and the perspectives from our Indigenous neighbors on human rights and issues facing them in the city. And to that end, we must acknowledge that we are working today on the territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This is the meeting place of Toronto that is still home to over 70,000 diverse Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. In a minute, I'm going to introduce this morning's moderator so that she can introduce our panel. But once we finish the last series, of questions, we'll take your questions in the chat. So please, as I said earlier, don't hesitate, use the chat. And I often remind the folks that are here that have expertise in a variety of areas, if there's a question you know the answer to and you're sitting in the audience, please don't hesitate to offer an answer as well. This is meant to be a conversation with your neighbors. It's not just about our speakers, although they have lots of important things to say. It's also about what you have to say. So please feel free to contribute. At the end of our formal discussion, we've got 2 intimate chats scheduled, so we hope you'll stick around. We have folks from Anishinaabe Health Toronto, as well as one of our Vision 2020 fund holders, inviting you to learn more about her giving circle on food security. So that starts at 9 o'clock, and we invite you to join us there. Today, I'm looking forward to another bold and brave conversation. And all bold, brave conversations, if they're going to be truly brave, sometimes make us uncomfortable. Here at Toronto Foundation, we believe we have to create spaces for these challenging conversations, and we know you'll participate in them with the spirit of respect and safety. And we ask you to keep that in mind as you're putting your questions in the chat. So now it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator. Seher Shafiq is the active Citizenship Manager at North York Community House and Managing Editor for Ryerson's First Policy Response Initiative. In her free time, she also produces and hosts a podcast called The Second Generation, which highlights the experiences of second-generation immigrants and millennials. I'm so delighted to have Seher here, and I know she's going to introduce the panelists and dive into questions, but I have a quick question for her first, which is, Seher, would you start by explaining your definition of what advocacy is?
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you to Toronto Foundation for curating such an important session and bringing us all together for this conversation. In advance of this session, I was thinking about advocacy and what it means to me. And I think that what it is public support for a particular cause, and it could be for a particular policy, but not necessarily. This kind of support, I think, could take so many forms, political or not. The political is what we tend to associate advocacy with. So things like starting a petition, organizing or participating in protests, lobbying, maybe running for office. But when it comes to nonprofits, there's so many other ways that advocacy happens. It could take the form of writing op-eds or producing research papers that produce statistics that support your cause, speaking about an issue to your network. It could look like coordinating the sector to take action on a particular issue that you care about. And sometimes for nonprofits, it's simply about being loud and showing your work and being vocal about it, because so much of that sometimes is invisible, and even showing all of the hard work that's happening can support your cause that you're working on. So this year, we're in December, and I think this year and this moment is such a historical moment. This year has really illustrated the giant gaps and systemic issues that are there, from the pandemic to the murder of George Floyd. We have seen all of the different ways that advocacy can happen, and this pandemic and everything else that's going on continues to show us that. And so advocacy at nonprofits, I personally think, has never been more important than it is right now. And I'm so happy that we have this incredible panel that represents so many different types of advocacy. And we need all of those types of advocacy in order to push for systemic change that we want. So I'm really excited to introduce the panel. Neethan, let's start with you. So Neethan Shan is the Executive Director of the Urban Alliance for Race Relations, and he's also served on Toronto City Council and been a school board trustee, both in Toronto and in York Region. So on the screen here, we can see one statistic that leaves no doubt about the critical nature of your work, Neethan. Neethan, in a minute or less, what do you think are the top 3 things that people need to understand about the issue that you're committed to addressing?
Well, just taking on the issue of education, and as you can see from the statistics, Seher, that the disproportionality of student disciplining is something that is alarming. And what we have to figure out, and soon have to figure out, that the education system is broken. It is not broken in one place, it's broken in multiple places, to the extent that you cannot have simple fixes. You have to have a transformative process around education system. You have to have an alternative vision to it. And the school to prison pipeline, as you see, does not just start at high school. It starts right from kindergarten to over disciplining, over penalizing, over surveillance of Black students and other racialized students, looking at disproportionate use of power, whether it be within the school system or within the intersection between school system and the criminal justice system. So it's very important to look at a process where we can transform it. One of the other ways in which this also happens is because of erasure, that students don't feel reflected in the curriculum. Students don't feel acknowledged as individuals within the system. When it's a negative thing, there's an overshining of light. When there are positive things, there's under recognition. So you see this kind of a Eurocentric white supremacy embedded into our education system. So I would just say, I only have a minute to talk about such a vast issue to start with. I would say, what we need is not simple fixes in education. I was talking about curriculum when I came at the age of 16 as a refugee youth to this country 25 years ago. A quarter century later, we've just adapted different terms to talk about wanting to change, but not really change. So we see achievement gap change into learning gap, change into opportunity gap. All of those terms are being changed, and racism is adapting itself by adapting new terms, but not necessarily adapting new solutions as a system.
Thank you, Neethan. You've given us so much to think about already. Next, let's meet Liben Gebremikael. Liben is the Executive Director at TAIBU Community Health Centre and is the current chair of the Board of Directors at the Alliance for Healthier Communities, both very amazing, impactful organizations. So Liben, we've got your statistic up on the screen. What are the top 3 things that people should understand about the issue that you are committed to addressing?
Thank you for this opportunity. And if I can just touch upon what Neethan was saying earlier on, and it's a good segue to kind of my conversation here, is that the education system is actually not broken. I think the system was designed to create an outcome that we are seeing right now. So I think that's where the challenges we have. So when we look at statistics such as this, is that it's not that the institutions and the systems that exist are broken. They were not designed to serve racialized and marginalized communities, including Indigenous and Black communities. And the outcome that we see is that the impact is disproportionate to those communities. So when we are thinking of the impact of COVID, which is something really that has highlighted, some people have been talking about, and I'm also talking about COVID as an X-ray, right? It's really showing us what has been happening in the system for the longest time. It's not just because COVID that happened that we have a disproportionate impact. We are seeing it in the education system. We are seeing it in chronic conditions. We are seeing it in mental health, impact of mental health of Black communities, Indigenous communities, and racialized communities. So when then addressing these issues of an impact such as this on racialized communities, There is the quick response, emergency response, that is very important. But the strategy should be at looking at the system itself, the foundation of how access to services, employment conditions, transportation, housing, all those things have to be part of a response of a COVID response. Otherwise, we will just only be addressing the symptoms, which is right now the COVID, right? Maybe putting some food security initiatives in place, which is 100% really required. We would be doing certain kind of activities such as increased testing. But then, hopefully this should go. We would like this COVID to disappear, and hopefully with the vaccine and more education, we will be flattening the curve. But then we will remain with the system itself, where continuous generational disproportionate impact on the health and well-being of communities, whether it's youth, whether it's seniors, whether it's adults, whether it's education, whether it's employment, whether it's health. That is going to remain, and I think that is the strategy that we want to engage. When we're engaging with institutions, systems, we are looking at a long-term strategy to address the foundational challenges.
Thank you, Liben. And I know you co-authored a STAR op-ed yesterday that touches on some of these points and has a call to action. So I hope we'll explore that throughout this conversation. Next up is Patti. Patti Pettigrew is a former Gladue writer and an advocate for vulnerable Indigenous women for over 40 years. Patti is a member of the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan First Nation in northeastern Ontario. And Patti, there are some really hard-hitting stats up on the screen. In the next minute, can you tell us your 3 things that people should understand about the issue that you have been working tirelessly for the last 40 years?
The first thing is I think that in order to understand the issue that, my organization is focused on, you have to really have a clear understanding of the history of genocide within Canada. I mean, we have gone from the residential school experience to the Sixties Scoop to over-incarceration of Indigenous women. And I think that right now, Canada, with this pandemic, is getting a little taste of what we as Indigenous people have experienced over the last 500 years. I mean, when we were taken to residential school, our children were taken from us. We weren't allowed to hug our loved ones. We had to social distance. Our language was taken. And if you look at women right now who are incarcerated, we've been living under the same conditions as if we had COVID. Into that, the same conditions apply inside the prisons of not being able to connect with our families, having to socially distance, all the conditions that Canadians are experiencing throughout COVID, being in a lockdown situation where your ability to travel and your freedom, is jeopardized. Women are experiencing this every day for years inside of Canadian prisons, and Indigenous women. And so I think that I know that in order to understand truly the impact, we have to understand the history, and we have to really recognize that we are the first people of this land. And as such, we're connected on a very deep spiritual level to the land that we're on. Yet we live in communities where during this time of COVID and long before COVID, we can't drink the water. We can't even wash in the water. Canadians are very lucky in that they can go turn on their taps and they can wash their hands during COVID. There are so many reserves right now that can't do that. So we really need to look at what is going on, because I can tell you right now that this system, this Canadian system, does not work for us. That's what I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much for making all those points. And I see Julia has also written in the chat, and we hadn't thought about how the experience of social isolation relates to these historical experiences of Indigenous peoples. So thank you for putting that frame on this conversation. So now let's meet our final panelist. Sarah Jama is a community organizer from Hamilton and is the co-founder of the Disability Justice Network of Ontario. Sarah, in the next minute or so, will help us understand some of the key points that drive your work.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm based out of Hamilton, mainly because Hamilton has the largest density of people with disabilities in the province of Ontario. So I'll start there. One of the things that I'm pretty preoccupied right now is shedding light upon the fact that people with disabilities have particularly been left behind during this pandemic. And what I mean by that is we've seen the ways in which people with disabilities were left out of the COVID emergency response funding that everyone else got. So while everyone else was given a minimum of $2,000 a month, people with disabilities were still legislated into poverty across this country, particularly in Ontario. ODSP rates have not risen with inflation. And so people are receiving not enough to even pay rent and eat food, simply for being disabled. What we're seeing is the deaths around COVID are predominantly senior citizens in our long-term care homes who are predominantly disabled people, right? And so we're seeing a situation where people who cannot work, who are perceived to not be able to contribute back to society in regards to like our GDP and the economy, are being left to die quite literally. And you see that with regard to for example, the triage protocol that came out in Ontario that's still being amended, but nobody has seen the new draft of, where disabled people would be at the bottom of the totem pole with regard to who would receive oxygen tanks should there be a shortage in this country, simply because of how you're born. And what we're seeing across Canada right now, the growth of encampments, the growth of people living in tents outside, being displaced from parks simply because they are outside, and you're not allowed to have tents outside in parks. So they're moving from park to park to park because our shelter systems are not adequately equipped to deal with disability and mental health concerns. So people have a high turnover rate, and then even being offered hotels where there's a high turnover rate because of the same issue. And so we're seeing people with disabilities more than before be criminalized simply for being disabled, being pushed into poverty, legislated into poverty, and then left there. And it ties back to kind of what Patti was talking about, a history in this country of the institutionalization of Indigenous people.
Oh,
Sorry, I cut off for a bit. The history of institutionalization of Indigenous people, but also disabled people. We had institutions like the Aurelia Asylum for Idiots and the Feeble-Minded, not too far from Hamilton, where thousands of people with disabilities were sexually, physically, and emotionally abused. The same language around residential schools was used to get disabled people to be sent to these schools as children, and a lot of them were buried without names, just numbers. And these institutions didn't close until the 90s, but as part of the fabric of society, where we say disabled people aren't allowed to exist in public with the rest of our communities. So you see a high statistic of disabled people in jails when they should be supported in other ways, or just legislated into poverty. One of the examples that come to mind for me right now is Solomon Fakiri, a Muslim man with schizophrenia who was literally beaten to death by prison guards when he was waiting for a hospital bed, simply because he was a person of color, simply because he was disabled. I'm thinking about Abdirahman Abdi, an autistic Somali man with autism, who was also beaten to death. I'm thinking about Regis Paquette, who died after a mental health call in Toronto. I'm thinking about DeAndre Campbell, a Black man who also died after he called police for his own mental health supports. I'm thinking about Ijaz Chowdhury, a Muslim man who was also killed after a mental health call, right? And the ways in which people with disabilities are especially being criminalized, have always been criminalized simply for existing, and during this pandemic are being left to die. I think that's what I would start with.
Thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge that we are talking about some really, really heavy things, and you all are you're dedicating your lives to these issues. And a lot of times that work is underpaid, undervalued. And I mean, this isn't a physical room, but if it were, I can imagine that a lot of people are feeling the heaviness that I am listening to the incredible and impactful work and difficult work that you all do. So just wanted to say that. So why for you all is advocacy essential to making long-term change on the issues that you care about? And as you talk about that, can you share a couple of tangible examples about what your advocacy has looked like, and perhaps a story, if there is one, of that captures the impact of your work? Liben, would you like to go first?
Okay, thank you. I think, you know, all the work that we do, from me, how I see it is every program, activities, engagement we have is advocacy, right? Sometimes we really think about advocacy when we're trying to push certain agendas forward. But I think advocacy is, you know, occupying a space on behalf of people who don't have the voice. So we try to put advocacy in all the programs that we do, knowing that there is already a disproportion and an inequity that exists. So filling those gaps is the work of advocacy of what we do. So when we are designing a program or when we are seeking some resources to do certain activities, we see that as an advocacy. And so, you know, if it is around seniors and making sure that seniors are active in the community, it's allowing for their voices to be represented in what we do, for example, right? Do we design programs and then invite communities to come and take part, or do we design the program with them, which is a good start, but giving them opportunities, power, capacity to be designing the program that they want, and then help facilitate the implementation of the program, right? And then I think from us as an organization, what we really want to do is move from a position of advocacy to creating ally relationship with the different equity deserving groups, whether it's seniors, whether it's disability, something that we have not done a lot, I should admit, particularly the intersections of racialization and the different other challenges that we have. And so we need to move to that space where actually we're creating space for those voices to be represented by themselves is what we should be doing. And one thing that as an example, you said if you can give an example, one thing that we have done is working with the Indigenous communities here in Scarborough, for example. You know, when we were tasked to kind of develop a program for Indigenous communities here in Scarborough, as a non-Indigenous group, we felt that that was a very sensitive and had to be managed in a respectful way. And then as an association, as an alliance for CHCs, we also passed a resolution that really adhered to the principle of Indigenous health in Indigenous hands. And so with that principle and foundation in mind, we engaged the community, established support to establish a Scarborough Indigenous Wellness Advisory Council, who is now responsible to identify the needs for the community, to plan and design activities, program, culturally and traditionally appropriate program and services. And we're just providing support, whether it's administrative support, space support, any kind of other support, right? So that is what, you know, we started with advocacy, but we created the space to be occupied by the people who need to occupy the space for them then to make decision as to how services should be developed. So moving to this ally relationship position should be the ultimate goal of doing advocacy work.
Thank you, Liben. And you said something near the front end of your remarks, which I want to highlight, which is that even by providing those services and programming, that's advocacy, because you are providing or enabling seniors or whoever is part of your programming to have a voice. And that's a really important angle in which to look at advocacy, I think. So thank you for that. Patti, would you like to share, why is advocacy essential for you in making long-term change? And I know we haven't come very far, you've been doing this work for decades, but can you speak a bit to why you do the work that you do and what it's looked like over the past few decades?
So the reason I do the work I do is because it's saving lives. For instance, right now we go out to Vanier Institution for Women, and we pick up women who are being released from the institution, and we house them. Women are being released, Indigenous women are being released from Vanier Institution at 7:30 at night, 10 o'clock at night, and knowing the statistics on murdered and missing Indigenous women, it's an atrocity that they're being released with no place to go and just expected to make their way into the city or wherever. So we've started trying to address that by picking them up in our van and housing them. I think, I mean, so in fact, I mean, we're saving lives and we know this. The other thing is that we're also, we've put out about just over 400 backpacks filled with PPE and personal hygiene products. We give them to the women when they're released. We distribute them to Indigenous organizations so that they can distribute them to members of our community who are homeless, you know, who are experiencing food insecurity. We even took some to the men's shelter in Scarborough. And because, you know, we're not going to get through this unless we work together. And we recognize that. But we do need for Canadians to listen to us and to hear our voice, because we have been talking for years now about what's going on with the environment. I mean, that's why the building that we are building in Scarborough is going to have a zero carbon footprint. I mean, these are our instructions from our ancestors. And so we would ask that Canadians start to listen to what we have to say. But the bottom line, why we do the work we do is because we're saving Indigenous lives.
Thank you so much, Patti. And again, the theme of voice comes up again, but in this case, it's that voice has been there for so long, and now it's just time for us to listen. So thank you for making that point. Sarah, can you talk to us about your work and why is advocacy essential for you in advancing the causes that you care about?
I think particularly when talking about disability justice in Canada, advocacy is essential. I think a lot of young people with disabilities, as soon as you're born, you're given the language to understand your experience as though you're a burden on the state, and that in order to access supports, you need to ask for help. So if you need help, go to student accessibility services. If you need help, ask your parents. It's never about framing, okay, if you need something in our society and our society is not equipped to give it to you, how can we give you the tools to build the world that fits you? Where do you go when the services in place don't work? And so that's why it's essential in order to build the confidence and self-esteem of young people with disabilities in our communities. You start from the place of advocacy, self-advocacy, but also advocacy in communities. And so an example that worked for us in Hamilton was one of our members was talking about the assistive devices program and how it's not actually integrated into the Canada Health Act. And so many people, including myself, have to pay thousands of dollars for our equipment, whether it's like an electric wheelchair or a hearing aid device or even an oxygen tank. These supplies are not exactly all covered by the government, even though they should be, because it's an essential part of our healthcare. The government also doesn't cover repairs. And so if you have your equipment taken away to be fixed, you don't really get a loaner and things like that. Anyway, so we drafted a petition that got thousands of signatures asking for a reform of the assistive devices program. And then that turned into a motion being moved at Queen's Park in terms of the reforms we were asking for. And that was all youth led. And that was all youth who were saying, yeah, we need this to be fixed because it's literally harming us. And so I think advocacy is important to show people that you don't have to settle for the world as it is. You can be creative and push for solutions on your own. I think a lot of organizations are terrified of engaging in advocacy because it was not too long ago that you could only spend 10% of your overall funding on advocacy in and of itself. But I think we are in a sector where we fight for grants among each other and are so focused on the next year of funding that it actually limits our potential to be able to push for change that would impact our service users, right? And so I think advocacy is essential because it's showing people on the ground that you're with them in the struggle and that you're seeing what the issues are, and you're going to push to change that versus just offering band-aid solutions along the way.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And last but not least, Neethan, can you speak to some of examples of what your advocacy has looked like and why it's essential in making long-term change?
Yeah, I think Seher, before that, I think advocacy could very well become the buzzword that gets co-opted in 5 years by entire system, because that's the direction I'm seeing. So I want to break it down a little bit. We tend to think of racism as a system of disadvantage, and that's how we generally talk about racism. If these communities are disadvantaged and so on. I think if we shift that thinking to say racism is a system of advantage on the backs of certain communities, and who gets advantage gets spotlighted. And it's very important to do that because right now we see a lot of burden of advocacy being placed on racialized communities. And because it's seen as you have to give voice to the voiceless, but there's nothing as voiceless as Arundhati Roy would say. There are people deliberately unheard or deliberately silent. So who are these people who are deliberately unhearing these people and silencing people? And I think that's why the white population don't have to speak in terms of disadvantaged communities. White population can speak as an advantaged community, say they want to advocate to give up their advantage. That is perfectly all right. So if we have a movement of white people saying, this is a movement advocating to give up advantage, that is different from saying this is a movement trying to, fight disadvantage. We will fight the disadvantage. Advocacy is not a choice for racialized communities. It is a day-to-day reality. So it's not a question of whether it's essential or not. You are doing it constantly every day in all of your spaces. So, and I also want to remind that if people are not advocating the racialized people, it is not up to other people to judge, because existing in the system itself is a resistance. Existing in the system itself is a form of resistance. So I think it's important to know the people will advocate when they want to. People will step out of advocating if they have to, if they're racialized people experiencing various forms of oppression. So I think it's very important to clearly identify that advocacy doesn't become this buzzword that starts getting used and being co-opted. While having said that, the status quo is status quo, not by accident. We think of status quo and think that it's automatically sustaining itself. It is not automatically sustaining itself. Every day, there are people who believe in white supremacy, people who believe in Eurocentrism, people who benefit from white privilege, who constantly do things to keep the status quo. So they're investing energy into it. And so what we are doing on the other side as an advocacy is to kind of counter that with our, so it could be petition, it could be protest. Today, look at examples of parents of Black children, for example, particularly Black mothers in York region, in Peel region, shifting power, getting people to respond. That is advocacy. That is, sometimes you don't have to be in boardrooms to advocate. And there's been a lot of long discussion about you have to be at the table to do it. And a lot of the time, these tables have been very, very tokenistic. So I think it's very important that the advocacy happens at all levels, from individual level to a collective level, but not to shift burden of change to the people who are. Racism is not a problem racism is not racialized people's problem. Racism is the problem of non-racialized people. And so who needs to own the solution, who needs to own having to find the solution has to shift. I think as we move through this discussion, we have put out billboards, digital billboards about police not being the answer on downtown. It took a lot of money to do it. And why should that be a racialized community investing the money, the hard-earned money to do those kind of things? If fairly enough people realize that the police system itself is a racist infrastructure created to surveil and penalize and punish racial, or keep the white supremacy alive, then the people who should be advocating should be people who are advantaged by this system, investing the money, that's their responsibility. It's not about guilt. It's about knowing that your advantage does not come because of merit. Your advantage comes because of long history of systemic oppression and building it on the backs of other people who are Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities.
Thank you so much, Neethan. You always have a way of making me question my very basic assumptions about so many things, and thank you for that thoughtfulness. I want to highlight one thing you said, which is that for many communities, including racialized communities, advocacy is not a choice. It is day-to-day survival, and I think that is what Patti, Liben, Sarah, and yourself have been demonstrating throughout this panel, which I think should be a symposium because there's so much to talk about. So thank you to all of you for sharing your stories and your ideas and examples with us. To the audience, feel free to pop some of your questions into the chat and we can start getting to them. But before we move into the next set of questions, Toronto Foundation does have one other voice that it wants to bring into the conversation, and that is the voice of Gillian, who lives with a disability right here in the city. She's currently being supported by the Centre for Independent Living of Toronto, and here she is in her neighborhood sharing her own experience of life during COVID.
At the height of the pandemic, I would turn on the television to hear the updates, but I don't really do that anymore because it still kind of makes me anxious. I'm taking a course at George Brown right now in student advising student support certificate, and then usually in the afternoon I might go on Zoom and participate in a peer connect session with the Center for Independent Living, because that program is taking place right now to connect people with disabilities. The biggest challenges during the pandemic for me has been the social isolation and not being able to see too many people and go places. I've been able to keep connected to them. And then here at my building, I'm connected with Bellwoods for attendant care services. For myself, some of the challenges might be when the city starts to open up more. Sometimes I need support when I go out in the community with attendant care. I'm not sure how things will work with working with PSWs out in the community. Some people have trouble with rent. They may need help with transportation, or in order to participate in a certain event, they need attendant care at certain events, unless it's through something like Zoom. But even still, some people with disabilities, they don't have access to, they might not have access to a computer. When things get tough, I usually have some resourcefulness and resilience, but I gotta have those resources and connections in place.
Was muted there. Gillian is one of many that are being supported by the nonprofit organizations in the city. And there's absolutely no doubt that the demand for support from local nonprofits has gone up significantly this year. I think we've all seen that happen. So the last question, and I'm going to merge a few questions into one because we've had so much to talk about. Based on the findings of Toronto Foundation's recent Toronto Nonprofit Survey, 86% of the organizations surveyed indicated that nonprofits would need to allocate more resources to advocacy because of the pandemic, which makes sense. But some people argue that nonprofits shouldn't be using their funding for advocacy. So I want to ask all four of you, why do nonprofit leaders feel so strongly about advocacy? This is a big question. What are the biggest barriers? And if you could close with one opportunity that you see. And Liben, why don't we start with you?
I thought you were going to pick up on somebody else for so yes, I saw some interesting conversation in the chat as well in terms of what we mean by advocacy and how we present ourselves as to funders or to sources when we're talking about advocacy, because I think it creates a challenge, right? If the word advocacy, as somebody mentioned in the chat, it triggers an alarm of, right? But everything that I think a lot of nonprofit organizations are doing is actually advocacy. So how do we present ourselves as advocacy and the benefits of advocacy, right? So if it can be presented as a work that really elevates, words like capacity building could be advocacy work that we can do, right? I know there are some very kind of political advocacy work that needs to happen, the lobbying, the protesting, the pushing back, the highlighting some of the challenges to government agencies, to corporations, to nonprofit organizations, and funders is very important. But I think if we look at a broader systems change, without advocacy being part of raising the voices of the marginalized and racialized groups to be heard, none of the nonprofit organizations are going to be doing the work, right? We've seen it in the video. It's real to people. So I think nonprofit organizations should continue the conversation of highlighting advocacy in different ways without creating that alarm and trigger for institutions. And then I think the other thing is also, some funders funders always look for impact, right? When they're giving you money, they're saying, okay, you need to be accountable and you need to show us the changes that you are planning to implement in your program, the outcomes, right? And then if we can demonstrate how we can get to the outcome through the different advocacy work that we can do, that also may be some kind of, how to present our work. As we said, advocacy is in many forms. Most of the work that we do is advocacy. So I think that may be a strategy for us to consider and, engage funders and government resources to say advocacy actually helps the government in reaching the outcomes that they're looking for, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Sarah, what about you? Barriers to advocacy in nonprofits and an opportunity. What do you think about that?
I think if there were any time for nonprofit leaders to engage in advocacy, now would be the time. The difference between those who are able to get by every single day and those who are living in extreme poverty and in conditions that are legislated, allowed by our current government structures, are just getting worse and worse. And I think all of us who are able to take on positions of leadership in nonprofits are living in a time period of extreme privilege where we're in a sector that only exists because of all the failures of our current societies. Nonprofits shouldn't even be needed, right? I think that, so because of that, we have the obligation to engage in as much advocacy as possible for in support of the people who maybe cannot do so on an individual level. And I think it's just our responsibility. We don't really have the excuse anymore of just not doing it because we're not allowed to, because the people who rely on your services and your sector require you to be more visible and more active in your allyship, and that requires advocacy as well. So I think it's not even a question of like, why should we? It's like, we must. That's where I'm coming at it from. I think the difficulty usually comes from fear. I think unfounded fear. in what doing advocacy work could mean for the future of the organization. But I think, again, I don't think we have the time for that anymore. And I think, especially if you're a person who is not a person of color and you're leading up a nonprofit or you have a high position in a nonprofit, it is your responsibility to figure out how to advocate for the people that you're doing work for. It's not enough to just do research that will sit on a shelf. How are you doing research, finding results, and then doing work to change those results, right? Or using that result in practical ways. For us, I think that looked like pivoting during the pandemic to literally deliver food to people who are disabled in my community because people simply could not get out to the grocery store for fear of transmission of COVID. And as I said earlier, Hamilton has the largest density of people with disabilities in the province. So yeah, it might not be in our mandate to figure out how to deliver food to people, but we did it and we figured it out. And then the community gave us like tons of support around our mutual aid project. So it's actually integrated into our organization now. It's going to continue, where we're going to continue to support people by offering food and delivering it to people's houses for free. For no money, because that was a need that needed to be met that wasn't being met. I'm saying that if you see an issue in your community that's not being addressed, figure out ways to support or figure out people on the ground who are doing that work, and how to support them, because we're running out of time to be driven by fear or this understanding that if we advocate, we're going to get a slap on the wrist for doing so. I think now calls for a time of bravery. And so figuring out how to incorporate advocacy into your work in real tangible ways, if you haven't already done so, is important.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I think along with bravery, there's also this urgency because like you said, nonprofits shouldn't necessarily have to exist. It's an indication that we are failing in some regard. Patti, what do you think?
So I think I don't know how to articulate it, but I think the fact there's something wrong. There's something wrong with the fact that we have to advocate, that we have to do this. For me as an Indigenous woman, I mean, it's a no-brainer, you know. I don't get why people don't really, in many ways, understand what's gone on here in Canada. And I guess it's because people are simply not educated about it. But having said that, I mean, if people, like, you know, people who have privilege should realize that if they don't want somebody breaking into their home, if they don't want somebody assaulting them, if they want to lower the rate of recidivism, they need to listen to us. And they need to say, you know what, this system's not working, your system does. I mean, I don't know what else to say about this. I just think that Indigenous people in this country and our organizations have been fighting and fighting and fighting to help our people survive. And I would say to Canadians, wake up, wake up. You need to start listening to us. And I don't know what's going to happen in Canada if we don't come together and listen to one another. And, you know, Indigenous organizations, we've got our moccasins on the ground and we've had to warrior up constantly. It has never stopped since the first settler came here, okay? It's been constant. We have been fighting for our lives and for our existence. And so how, you know, why we have to advocate for ourselves, just, I don't know, somehow it just doesn't make sense. So I would say in my advocacy, Canada, wake up. That's my message.
Thank you so much, Patti. And last but not least, Neethan, I know you have strong thoughts on advocacy and nonprofits. And
yeah, I could go on this for a while. Let me start off by saying I've been part of the not-for-profit family for about 20 years, and it's a bit of an extended family. We have all sorts of people. We have the rich people in the family. We have the poor people in the family. We have people from all races in this family. I have an issue with the sector, and I will say it because one of the issues is that the sector advocates well when it wants funding, but when it's about issues to the people that at the core who we are trying to improve lives for, we don't let them have town halls in our spaces. We say, the MP might be upset. Why don't we open up our spaces? Why don't we let, this type of work is not going to be funded, fine. At least there are resources in our sector that we can mobilize to allow people to have the spaces and the resources to do this work. Let's look at who is advocating. Not-for-profit sector, racialized community organizations, smaller organizations are putting themselves on the line advocating. The larger organizations that have millions of dollars are shying away from it. It should be the reverse, because you have a security of your funding. You have a long history. You have 100 years of history. You're not going to be touched on these issues. They're not going to come after you. Whereas the smaller organization, racialized community organization, get branded as risky and all. So they're putting themselves online. So it's not like the same. Not-for-profit sector is not homogeneous, and it's important for the rich cousins in our family to say, what is our advantage in these issues? How can we open up these spaces? We are not doing that. And when funding proposals get written, I'll come to the funders later, but it's heavy problematization of our communities. We need to talk about all the bad things about our communities, about racialized communities. We should almost like portray our young people as threats to the society to get this money. And then we have to say, pathologize our communities, racialized and at-risk communities to get this money is completely wrong. Because if you took all the funding proposals of the last 40, 50 years and put it into one document, you will see what a problematic BS applications those are. It's very important that we shift this, and the funders who are on the call, and I think, I said as a family because I'm part of the system, I'm part of the not-for-profit. So it's almost like I'm saying this out of rebelling at my home to make things better for my home, because not-for-profit sector has the most important role to play. It's not to dismantle the sector. This is the most important time of history that we need to play this role, especially with this new normal of COVID that's going to come out, could be worse for all of us than what it was before. And so it's very critical that we are alert. But we cannot do this as larger organizations eating up smaller organizations in our neighborhoods by co-opting their programs and then leaving them hanging later. This has been going on for too long. So I think we have to have a serious conversation about what is our core purpose of existing? Who are our people? When they come in, are we valuing their assets? Are we valuing their skills they bring? Or are we treating ourselves as an organization that is doing good by helping the needy? Because immigrants, young people, anybody who comes into the system are being treated like these are needy people, and the system is, the not-for-profit sector is there to assist them. It's not the case. These are people with a lot of potential. They could solve many of the issues in our neighborhood. They haven't been given the opportunities or the forum or the space by structural discrimination. And that, I think shifting that would be very critical. So transforming ourselves as a sector from charity model, we still have to be charity as an entity maybe, but from a social transformative justice model by bigger organization taking risks. I'm from Scarborough. Liben is an exception in some ways, but a lot of the Scarborough's large not-for-profit sector haven't spoken on any of these issues, including anti-Black racism, which is the most critical issue within Scarborough. And that's exactly why the politicians could go ahead and vote for not even 10% reduction in police budget. So I say that the not-for-profit sector needs to wake up and say, push back and say to funders that this is the kind of work we want to do. We can do it with your money, or we will find the resources to do it, because they are agents of change within their own structures. They could open up a lot of those resources. I think that shift will be something that is necessary. And the funders who are listening, transform your, fund more smaller organizations, fund more racialized community organizations. Ask the larger organization to collaborate in an equal basis. Make sure those benchmarks of equity and respect is part of those proposals. Don't ask for proposals that pathologize our communities. And so if we shift this together, I think we would be strong enough then to point the finger on other systems of oppression like capitalism and other things. But if we don't fix this, we are just kidding ourselves and continuing to look at our own survival as a sector rather than looking at solving the issues.
Thank you so much, Neethan. And we're almost at time. We have time for one question from the chat, but the rule is that you have to respond in one sentence or less. So Neethan, I'll start with you because it builds on the themes that you're discussing. The question from the audience is, when resources are limited, is it better for nonprofits to start their own advocacy initiatives or to partner with organizations that have experience with advocacy? One sentence or less.
I think you can do both. I think there's, take ownership, but at the same time, look around you and see those people who are doing marvelous work and get them in and build them up.
Great. Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Neethan there. I also think that, I think for everybody here, the one lesson I would take from today is that don't be afraid, be unafraid, because a lot of people on the ground without supports from nonprofits or systems right now are on the front lines trying to fight against white supremacy, push against change. And so you have the responsibility with access to resources that you do have to figure out what your role is and how to help the people on the ground push forward their causes. So be unafraid, because you have no reason to be afraid in the positions that you're in right now.
Great advice. Patti, what do you think? Oh, you're muted there.
There. So I'll just keep it short and sweet. I agree with Neethan. Do both.
Do both. Great. Liben?
Same here. I think there's also impact with coming together as a community and as a group. So I think do both.
Great. Well, thank you all. This is incredible. I'm going to pass it over to Sharon for some remarks.
Oh my goodness, folks. Neethan, Liben, Patti, Sarah, Seher, thank you so much. I have been writing furiously. I know I've seen a lot of great conversation in the chat, but I just want to reinforce a few things, particularly for a group on this call that are white or are funders or are both. I often obsess over the statistic. Everyone gets tired in my team of me saying it. 66% of all donations in this country go to only 1% of the charities. And to Neethan's point, it is a very inequitable sector. Those charities are enormous institutions. They are not often have big endowments. And I totally recognize I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth right now because I'm a big institution with a big endowment. But the fact is that we must look differently at the way power is dispersed in this country, and power and money are very connected, and money in this country tends to be white. And I say that with so much respect and so much passion, especially after hearing the conversation today. I don't know what it is going to take to get donors to think differently, funders to think differently about the way they engage, the way they listen. The themes I heard today, I just have to reinforce, and I recognize I'm pushing our time limits here, but I have to say it. Courage, so much courage on this panel, so much courage. The intersections, we talk about intersectionality a lot, and it sounds like such a jargony word, but gosh, didn't we hear it today? Those intersections between gender and race and ability and wealth and power and identity. It is my donors will ask me, how can I have most impact? I think my answer today would be two things. Look for those areas that have the most intersections, and you will, if you can change what's happening in there, it's big. And advocacy, but how complex this word is and how ill-defined it is, or how wrongly defined it is, because it is so much of what all the organizations we fund do, but it's not lobbying. Like everyone sort of sees it as this broad burning kind of lobbying thing. It's so much more. And I hope our audience really is taking that to heart. And I cannot, two other words, I'm sorry, history. Patti said this best, but everyone has referenced it. Gosh, we white folks need to revisit history deeply revisit it, go back, reread. it's not what you think it is. And our role in it is so core to where we are today. And we have to, which is the last word I'm going to really take away and think about, is advantage. This isn't, I'm thinking of an anti-advantage movement, Neethan. I'm, you know, what is, it's stop talking about anti-racism. Let's talk about anti-advantage. Let's own this issue and how can we really tackle it. So we need to be listening. We need to be acting, and the real change comes at the systems level and advocacy, and the advocates on this call who go from youth to 40 years of advocacy, like the whole spectrum is here. And I thank you all so much for giving us time. I know you're all very busy. And for the folks on this call, I just feel we have borne witness to a really powerful conversation, and I hope it's inspired you to act, to invest, to really go back and do your homework on these issues. And for folks in the sector, we are here with you. We want to be allies to this work, and I hope a little bit of today gives you a sense of that passion. So I do have to transition us, and I know a bunch of you might be leaving us at this point, so I want to say thank you. I want to remind you that the Good to Give guide for Toronto Foundation came out just a week or so ago. I was telling my team, my 14-year-old daughter spent 2 hours pouring through this guide, trying to narrow down the Avery family's giving over the holidays, and is having a really hard time. There are some fantastic Black-led and Indigenous-led organizations listed, plus a whole range of other organizations we've granted to in the last year, and we're hoping to convince others to do the same thing. And so please take a visit to our website. I think the team's going to stick that up in the chat if you want to click through. And